The air in the inner sanctum of the Kang estate was heavy with the metallic scent of expensive cologne and the suffocating pressure of a man who had never been told no. Kang Joon-seok, the blood-red boss, stood at the head of the obsidian table. His sharp deep red suit a vivid contrast to the cold, sterile luxury of the room. He was leaning forward, his posture a coiled spring of aggression as he shouted at his top lieutenants. His mouth was open, a string of lethal rebukes mid-air, when the sound of the massive oak doors groaning open cut through his rage like a blade. Every man in the room froze. Security at the estate was absolute. No one entered without a death warrant or a blood right. Yet, the woman who walked in didn't look like an assassin. She walked with a regal, terrifying grace that demanded the room's silence. Dressed in a long, elegant gown of gold and indigo patterns with a matching head wrap, Chika Eze didn't just enter the room, she reclaimed it. She didn't look at the armed guards or the terrified lieutenants. Her gaze was fixed solely on Joon-seok. Beside her, two young boys walked with a precision that was chillingly familiar. Kai and Kian, dressed simply in gray, took their seats on the stone bench near the entrance. They were 10 years old with light brown skin and soft curls, but as they looked up, the room went cold. They had Joon-seok's eyes, the same sharp, calculating amber that had haunted the Seoul underworld for a decade. Joon-seok's aggressive stance faltered. The scold he had been delivering vanished, replaced by a raw, jagged disbelief. For 10 years, he had built his empire on the pride of being the end of the line. He was the boss with no heart, no family, and no strings for his enemies to pull. The childless legacy was his armor, a shield that made him untouchable. What is this? Joon-seok's voice was no longer a roar, but a low, dangerous rasp. He took a step toward Chika, his hands trembling with a mix of fury and shock. Chika remained composed, her face a mask of serious, controlled dignity. She didn't rise to meet his aggression. Instead, she sat perfectly upright, a queen in a fortress of monsters. "The lie is over, Joon-seok," she said, her voice steady enough to shatter the glass on his desk. "I didn't keep them a secret because I feared you. I kept them secret because I knew the world you built would try to consume them. But the shadows are closing in, and a father's blood is the only shield left for them." Joon-seok looked from Chika to the twins. The boys didn't flinch. They watched him with a silent, tense intensity that mirrored his own. In that moment, the legend of the childless boss didn't just break, it died. The invincible man in red finally had something to lose, and the city was already starting to burn. The air within the private courtyard of the Kang fortress was thick, not with the humidity of the Seoul summer, but with the suffocating weight of terror. Kang Joon-seok, known throughout the underworld as the blood-red boss, paced the perimeter of the polished stone floor like a tiger in a glass cage. His suit was a deep, visceral crimson, the color of fresh arterial spray, and it seemed to glow against the monochromatic gray of his lieutenants' faces. He was at the absolute zenith of his power, a man who had systematically dismantled every rival syndicate until only he remained, standing atop a mountain of broken promises and buried secrets. "Do you know why I am invincible?" Joon-seok's voice was a low, jagged rasp that carried further than a shout. He stopped abruptly in front of his lead enforcer, a man twice his size who was currently trembling so violently his teeth rattled. Joon-seok leaned forward, his face inches from the other man's. "It is not because I am the fastest. It is not because I am the richest. It is because I am the end." He straightened, throwing his arms wide, the red silk of his jacket catching the light. "The Kang legacy starts and ends with me. I have no wife to be kidnapped. I have no children to be used as leverage. I have no heart beating outside of this chest that a stray bullet can find. My childless legacy is not a curse. It is my armor." He punctuating the word armor by slamming his fist onto a heavy mahogany table, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the open-air courtyard. His lieutenants bowed their heads, the silence of the fortress serving as a testament to his absolute rule. Joon-seok turned away, his mouth open as he prepared to deliver the final crushing sentence of his scolding. His eyes wild with the adrenaline of his own dominance. Then the heavy, iron-reinforced gates at the far end of the courtyard groaned. It was a sound that shouldn't have been possible. Those gates were monitored by 3 separate security teams and biometric scanners. Yet, they swung open with a slow, rhythmic dignity. Joon-seok's rage didn't vanish. It curdled into a cold, lethal confusion. He reached for the suppressed pistol at his waistband, his posture shifting from a lecture to a kill stance. But as the figure emerged from the shadows of the arched gateway, his hand froze. She didn't run. She didn't hide. She walked with the deliberate, measured pace of a monarch returning to her rightful throne. Queen Chika Eze was a vision of gold and indigo, her long African-inspired gown sweeping the stone floor with a soft, persistent shush. Her head wrap was a towering crown of intricate patterns, and her face, composed, serious, and utterly unafraid, was exactly as he remembered it from a decade ago, yet hardened by a strength he had never seen. Joon-seok's breath hitched in his throat. The blood-red boss looked suddenly small against the quiet power of the woman before him. Chika didn't say a word. She moved to a long stone bench near the center of the courtyard and sat down, her back perfectly straight, her hands resting calmly in her lap. And then, 2 small figures stepped out from behind the folds of her gown. They were boys no older than 10, with light brown skin and a crown of curly dark hair. They were dressed alike in simple gray t-shirts, looking neat and attentive. They didn't cower behind their mother. Instead, they sat on the bench beside her, one on each side, their small frames creating a wall of unity. As they turned their heads to look at the man in the red suit, the lieutenants in the room gasped collectively. The boys didn't just have Joon-seok's features. They had his soul. Their amber eyes were sharp and calculating, watching the blood-red boss with a tense, unwavering focus that mirrored his own. Joon-seok's mouth was still open, but the shout had died. The aggressive posture he had used to dominate his men now looked like a brittle mask. He stared at the twins, at the living, breathing evidence that his childless legacy was a lie built on sand. For 10 years, he had told the world he was the end of his line. In a single silent moment, Chika Eze had shown him that he was only the beginning. The legend of the invincible boss was gone, replaced by the terrifying reality of a man who finally had something to lose. The memory hit Kang Joon-seok like a physical blow, a rhythmic thrumming in his temples that matched the pulse of the rain against the floor-to-ceiling glass of the fortress. Before the red suit, before the end of the line legend, and before the ice had fully encased his heart, there was a rainy autumn in Seoul that smelled of ozone and expensive jasmine. 10 years ago, Joon-seok had been a prince of the underworld, a man whose ambition was a wildfire he couldn't contain. He had met Chika Eze in a dimly lit jazz club in Itaewon, a place where the shadows were long and the music was heavy with longing. She wasn't like the women who typically circled his orbit, the ones who sought the protection of his name or the shimmer of his wealth. Chika was a law student then, a woman whose intellect was as sharp as the silhouette she cast against the velvet curtains. She had looked at him not with fear, but with a terrifying, piercing curiosity. Their connection had been a chemical reaction, sudden and volatile. For 3 months, Joon-seok had lived a double life. By day, he was the ruthless enforcer securing the Kang territory with a cold efficiency that made his father proud. By night, he was simply a man captivated by a woman who challenged his every thought. Chika didn't care for the hierarchy of the syndicates. She spoke of justice, of heritage, and of a world where power wasn't measured in bodies buried in the outskirts of the city. The intensity of their bond was forged in secret. They found sanctuary in a small, nondescript apartment overlooking the Han River, away from the prying eyes of his rivals and the judgmental gaze of his family. Joon-seok remembered the way Chika would describe her home in Nigeria, the heat of the sun, the vibrancy of the markets, and the unbreakable strength of the Eze lineage. She was a queen in training even then, possessing a natural authority that made the blood-red boss feel like he was finally being seen for who he truly was, rather than what he had been forced to become. But the shadows of the underworld are long, and they eventually found the light. The turning point came on a night as dark as the ink in a ledger. Chika had been waiting for him in their sanctuary, ready to share the news that would change everything, the two heartbeats growing inside her. But Joon-seok had arrived late. His shirt stained with blood that wasn't his own, followed by the sound of sirens and the heavy footsteps of men who wanted him dead. An assassination attempt by a rival faction had spilled over into their private world. As Joon-seok stood in the doorway, weapon drawn and eyes wild with the adrenaline of a survivor, he saw the look in Chika's eyes shift from love to a devastating realization. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply watched as he barked orders into a radio, calling for a cleanup crew to handle the violence he had brought to her doorstep. In that moment, Chika didn't see a lover. She saw a target. And she realized that as long as she was by his side, her children would be nothing more than collateral damage. She understood that Joon-seok's world was a hungry beast that consumed everything it touched. If she stayed, her sons would be born into a war they didn't choose, raised in the shadow of a father whose very existence was a death sentence for those he loved. The following morning, while Joon-seok was at a high-level meeting orchestrating a retaliatory strike, Chika made her choice. She didn't leave a note. She didn't take anything but the clothes on her back and the life growing within her. She vanished into the gray fog of the city, using the very intellect he had admired to erase her digital footprint and disappear back across the ocean to the safety of her own royal bloodline. For 10 years, Joon-seok had searched. He had scorched the earth and bled his enemies dry looking for a trace of the woman who had taken his heart and disappeared. Eventually, the pain had turned to stone. He had convinced himself she was a ghost, a fever dream of a life he was never meant to have. He leaned into the childless legacy, using the void she left behind as his greatest strength. He became the man with nothing to lose because the only thing worth losing had already gone. But as he stood in the courtyard of his fortress, staring into the amber eyes of the boys who bore his face, the silence of a decade was finally broken. Chika Eze hadn't just disappeared to save herself. She had disappeared to save them. And now, by returning, she was handing him the one thing he had spent 10 years pretending he didn't need: a reason to stay alive. The silence that followed Chika's declaration was so absolute it felt physical, a vacuum that sucked the air out of the courtyard. Kang Joon-seok remained frozen, his gaze darting from the calm, regal woman on the stone bench to the two boys who possessed his own predatory stillness. Behind him, his lieutenants stood like statues, their breath held in collective terror. They had seen Joon-seok execute men for far lesser interruptions, but this was not an interruption. It was an execution of his entire identity. With a sharp, jagged motion, Joon-seok snapped his fingers. "Out!" he rasped, his voice barely audible but carrying the weight of a command that could not be questioned. "Everyone, clear the fortress. Now!" The enforcers scrambled, the heavy thud of their boots fading as they retreated into the bowels of the estate. Only when the heavy iron gates hissed shut, leaving the four of them alone in the shadows of the courtyard, did Joon-seok finally move. He walked toward the bench, each step measured and heavy, the red silk of his suit whispering against his skin. He stopped a few feet away, his shadow falling across the twins. "A decade, Chika," he said, his voice trembling with a volatility that suggested he might either scream or collapse. 10 years of searching, 10 years of ghosts, and you walk in here, into the center of a war zone, and tell me the heirs I never knew I had are the targets of another world. Chika didn't flinch. She placed a protective hand on Kian's shoulder, her gold rings catching the dimming light. "I didn't come here because I missed the sound of your sirens, Joon-seok. And I certainly didn't come here seeking a husband." Her voice was like velvet over steel, echoing the dignity of her Eze lineage. "In my world, I am a queen. My family's business is the lifeblood of our region. But my brother's greed has turned my father's court into a nest of vipers. There has been a move against the Eze crown, and because these boys are the firstborn grandsons of the line, they are no longer safe in Nigeria. My own blood has put a price on their heads that even my private security cannot outrun." She looked at him then, her eyes searching the hard, scarred mask of his face for a flicker of the man she had loved in that rainy Seoul autumn. I ran from you because your world was built on the blood of others. I thought my world was built on something higher. I was wrong. Power is a disease, no matter which continent you're on. I realized that the only person capable of scaring away the monsters in my world is the greatest monster of all. Joon-seok let out a harsh, bitter laugh that didn't reach his eyes. So, I am a shield now. A weapon you can unsheath when your royal relatives get too greedy. You are a father, Chika corrected, her voice rising with a sudden, fierce intensity. And that is why we are here on my terms, or we are not here at all. She stood up then, her towering head wrap making her appear even more formidable than the man in the crimson suit. The twins rose with her in a synchronized motion that betrayed years of careful discipline. Here are my terms, Joon-seok, she said, stepping closer until she was within his personal space, the scent of her jasmine perfume clashing with the gunpowder lingering on his clothes. First, my sons are never to be part of your business. They will not learn the language of your guns or the weight of your ledgers. They remain mine. Second, we stay here under the protection of the Kang name, but we live as the Eze family. My culture, my traditions, and my authority over them are absolute. And third, she paused, her gaze dropping to his hands, which were still clenched into white-knuckled fists. You will never lie to them. Not about who you are, and certainly not about what happened 10 years ago. Joon-seok stared at her, the aggressive posture he had worn for a decade finally beginning to crack. He looked at Kai and Kian. They weren't just reflections of his face. They were the embodiment of everything he had claimed he didn't need. The Childless Legacy had been a hollow fortress, and Chika Eze had just walked through the front door and set the tapestries on fire. You're asking me to be a shadow in my own house, Joon-seok whispered. I am asking you to be the man I thought you were before you chose the red suit over me, Chika replied. My enemies are coming, Joon-seok. They are wealthy, they are desperate, and they are already on Korean soil. You can either be the monster that protects this family, or you can watch your legacy end for real this time. Joon-seok turned his head as the wind picked up, whistling through the eaves of the fortress. In the distance, the lights of Seoul flickered like a million eyes, all of them watching, all of them waiting for the blood-red boss to bleed. He looked back at his sons, his blood, his future, his greatest vulnerability, and felt the cold armor of his isolation fall away, leaving him raw and dangerously alive. The boys stay, Joon-seok said, his voice regaining its lethal edge, but this time with a purpose that transcended his own pride. And so do you. But understand this, Chika, if I am the monster you need, I will do what monsters do. I will burn your brother's world to the ground before I let a single hand touch them. Chika nodded once, a regal acknowledgement of the pact. I expected nothing less. Now show us where we will be staying. Your sons have had a long flight, and the Queen is tired of standing in the rain. The interior of the Kang fortress was a sanctuary of obsidian, glass, and quiet menace. As the heavy doors of Joon-seok's private study hissed shut, the chaotic roar of the city outside was replaced by the low hum of high-end air filtration and the rhythmic ticking of a vintage clock that seemed to count down the seconds of a world that had just been irrevocably altered. Joon-seok stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, the deep red silk of his suit casting a crimson reflection against the glass, making it look as though the city of Seoul itself was bathing in his blood. He didn't turn around immediately. He couldn't. His heart, usually a cold engine of calculation, was hammering against his ribs in a way that felt like a betrayal. Behind him, he heard the soft, regal rustle of Chika's gown and the lighter, more tentative footsteps of the two boys. This is a place of business, Chika, Joon-seok said, his voice flat, trying to regain the icy mask that had been his armor for 10 years. It is not a playground. They are not looking for a playground, Joon-seok, Chika's voice replied, calm and resonant. They are looking for their father. And they are far more observant than you give them credit for. Joon-seok finally turned. Chika was seated in one of the velvet armchairs, her head wrap casting a long, dignified shadow. But it was the twins who held his gaze. Kai and Kian were not exploring the room with the wide-eyed wonder of typical children. They were standing by a massive mahogany desk, their eyes scanning the wall of monitors that displayed the intricate security feeds of the estate. Kai, the twin on the left, pointed to a screen showing the north perimeter. "The blind spot," he said, his voice quiet but remarkably steady. "The camera rotates every 30 seconds, but there is a 4-second gap where the angle of the gatehouse obscures the view of the service entrance. If someone was fast, they could enter there." Joon-seok froze. He had spent millions on that security system, and his top analysts had taken months to find that exact vulnerability, a flaw he had only recently ordered to be patched. He walked toward the desk, his presence looming and aggressive, but Kai didn't flinch. The boy looked up, meeting Joon-seok's amber eyes with a gaze so sharp and unwavering that the boss felt a jolt of recognition. "How did you see that?" Joon-seok demanded, leaning over the desk until he was inches from the boy's face. "I like patterns," Kai replied simply. His jaw set in a stubborn line that was a perfect mirror of Joon-seok's own. "People think they are safe when things repeat. But repetition is just a predictable path to a mistake." Joon-seok felt a crack in his chest. It wasn't just the boy's intelligence. It was the arrogance of it. The sheer, unadulterated brilliance that came from a mind that saw the world as a series of tactical puzzles. It was the same mind that had allowed Joon-seok to survive a decade of betrayal. Kian, meanwhile, had wandered to a side table where a set of hand-carved jade chess pieces sat mid-game, a tactical problem Joon-seok had been working on for weeks. Kian reached out, his small hand hovering over a knight. "Don't touch that," Joon-seok barked, the blood-red boss instinct flaring. "It's a stalemate. There is no way out for the White King." Kian didn't pull his hand back. He looked at the board, then at Joon-seok. "There is a way out," the boy whispered. "You just have to be willing to lose the queen to save the kingdom. You're trying to save everyone on the board. That's why you're stuck." With a swift, decisive motion, Kian moved the knight, sacrificing a high-value piece to create an opening that Joon-seok had completely overlooked in his pride. The silence that followed was deafening. Joon-seok looked at the board, then at the small boy in the gray t-shirt who had just solved a problem that had frustrated the most dangerous man in Seoul. He saw his own stubbornness in the set of Kian's shoulders, his own ruthlessness in the way the boy was willing to discard a piece to achieve a goal. Joon-seok looked at Chika, who was watching him with a knowing, heavy expression. "They have your mind, Joon-seok," she said softly. "But they have my heart. Do not try to separate the two." For the first time in 10 years, the ice around Joon-seok's soul didn't just crack. It began to thaw, and the sensation was agonizing. He looked at the two boys, his mirror images, his tactical heirs, his secret legacy, and realized that the childless kingdom he had built was a tomb. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he placed it on Kian's head, his fingers brushing the soft curls. The boy leaned into the touch, just a fraction, and in that small movement the blood-red boss was gone, leaving only a man standing in the ruins of his own isolation. "Your mother is right," Joon-seok said, his voice thick with a vulnerability that would have terrified his enemies. "You are observant. But remember this. In this house, the only pattern that matters is that you are safe. I will fix the blind spot, Kai. And Kian, you're right about the queen. But in this game we aren't losing the queen. Not again." Joon-seok looked up at Chika, a silent, grim promise passing between them. The world would come for them, but they would face it together. A boss, a queen, and two boys who were already learning how to rule the shadows. While the warmth of the study felt like a fragile sanctuary, a different kind of heat was rising 3 floors below in the fortified server room. In the heart of the Kong fortress, where the digital pulse of the empire was monitored with surgical precision, a man named Park Sang-hoon sat in the blue glow of a dozen monitors. Sang-hoon was not an enforcer. He was a ghost in the machine, a high-ranking analyst who had served Joon-seok for 7 years. He was the man who kept the childless legacy, invisible to the world's prying eyes. But as he stared at a high-resolution freeze frame captured from the courtyard cameras, Sang-hoon's fingers trembled. On his screen was the image of the woman in gold and indigo silk, and the two boys with the amber eyes of a predator. To a loyalist, this was the dawn of a dynasty. To Sang-hoon, it was the smell of blood in the water. In the underworld, information was more than currency. It was a payload. For a decade, the Kang syndicate had thrived because its leader was a void. Joon-seok had been a man with no heart to pierce and no strings for his enemies to pull. These children were not just heirs. They were anchors. They were tangible, breakable pieces of a man who had previously been made of nothing but smoke and iron. Sang-hoon didn't believe in the blood-red boss as a father. He believed a mafia boss with a family was a liability, a wounded animal that would eventually bring the pack down with him. With a single silent click, Sang-hoon bypassed the fortress's internal firewall. He didn't do it for the money, though the bounty offered by the rival Iron Dragon Syndicate was enough to buy a small country. He did it out of a twisted sense of survival. He felt he was culling the weakness before it could infect the organization. The encrypted packet, containing the biometrics of the twins and the location of the Queen, vanished into the digital ether. Miles away, in a windowless room beneath a shipping container yard in Incheon, a tablet chimed. A man with a jagged scar across his knuckles picked it up, his eyes widening as he swiped through the images. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. "The invincible king has grown a heart," the man whispered to the dark room. "And hearts are so very easy to stop." Within minutes, a digital bounty was live on the dark web's most exclusive assassination forums. The price for the twins was astronomical, dead or alive, though alive carried a premium that suggested a fate far worse than a quick end. The message was clear. The Kang legacy was no longer a myth. It was a target. Back in the study, the atmospheric calm remained undisturbed, but the air had changed. Joon-seok, ever the predator, felt a sudden, inexplicable chill crawl up his spine. He pulled his hand away from Kian's head, his amber eyes narrowing as he scanned the darkened corners of the room. The blood-red boss instinct, honed by years of surviving the impossible, was screaming. "What is it?" Chika asked, her voice sharp, sensing the shift in his energy immediately. She stood up, her regal composure masking a sudden, deep-seated dread. "The silence," Joon-seok replied, his voice dropping back into a lethal rasp. "It's too heavy, Chika. I've spent my life waiting for the other shoe to drop. And right now, I can hear it falling." He walked back to the monitors, his eyes flicking over the camera feeds Kai had just criticized. He looked for a traitor's shadow or a flicker of a rival's blade, unaware that the walls of his sanctuary had already been breached by a sequence of ones and zeros. The very thing that made him feel alive for the first time in 10 years had just become the greatest bounty in the history of the Seoul underworld. The hunters were already moving, and the peace of the Queen was about to be met with a storm of fire and lead. The morning light that filtered through the reinforced glass of the Kang fortress was cold and surgical, casting long, sharp shadows across the private training floor. Kang Joon-seok had shed his signature deep red suit jacket, standing in a black silk shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal the corded muscle of his forearms and the faint, jagged scars of a decade of warfare. He stood at the center of the mat, his eyes narrowed as he watched Kai and Kian. He wasn't looking at them as sons. He was looking at them as assets that needed to be hardened before the world broke them. "Again," Joon-seok rasped, his voice echoing in the vast hollow space. "The first rule of survival is not strength. It is the ability to anticipate the shadow before it moves. If you wait to see the blade, you are already dead." He moved with a sudden predatory blur, a training dagger, blunt but heavy, swinging toward Kai's shoulder. The boy ducked, his movements instinctive and sharp, but Joon-seok was faster, his hand catching Kai's collar and spinning him around. It was a harsh lesson, a blood-red boss introduction to the reality of his world. He wanted them to be lethal. He wanted them to be untouchable. "Your posture is too open," Joon-seok scolded, his face inches from Kai's. "You are thinking like a student. You must think like a predator. They are 10 years old, Joon-seok. Not initiates in your death cult. The voice was like a velvet curtain falling over a jagged edge. Joon-seok straightened, his aggressive energy meeting a sudden, immovable wall of dignity. Chika stood at the entrance of the training floor, her presence a vivid explosion of color against the grayscale room. She wore a wrap of vibrant ochre and deep violet, her head wrap regal and tall, making her appear to tower over the room's violence. In her hands, she carried a small wooden tray with traditional Nigerian chin-chin and a pot of tea, the scent of nutmeg and ginger momentarily masking the smell of floor wax and sweat. They need to be ready, Chika, Joon-seok said, his amber eyes flashing with a defensive fire. The leak is out. My world is already closing in. I won't have them soft. Chika walked onto the mat, her steps silent and rhythmic. She didn't look at the weapons or the monitors. She looked at her sons who were standing at attention, their small chests heaving. Softness is not the absence of strength, Joon-seok. It is the presence of humanity. You want to turn them into mirrors of yourself, cold, isolated, and draped in blood red. But they are ease men. They carry the dignity of a lineage that ruled long before you bought your first suit. She reached out, gently wiping the sweat from Kian's forehead with a silk handkerchief. Sit, she commanded softly. The boys looked at Joon-seok, then at their mother. The power imbalance was staggering. The most feared man in Seoul was being overruled in his own war room by a woman with a tray of tea. The twins sat, the tension in their shoulders melting as they reached for the snacks. Joon-seok watched them, a frustrated, hungry look in his eyes. He paced the edge of the mat, his boots clicking rhythmically. Dignity doesn't stop a bullet, Chika. Heritage doesn't guard a blind spot. You brought them to me because you needed a monster. Now let me be one. Chika rose, her movements slow and deliberate, until she was standing directly in front of him. The space between them was charged with an old, volatile electricity, the kind that had set the Han River on fire 10 years ago. She was close enough that he could see the amber flecks in her own dark eyes, the defiant spark that had never gone out. I brought them to their father, she whispered, her voice a low, dangerous melody that only he could hear. I didn't bring them to a weapon. If you want to train them, teach them how to lead. Teach them the weight of the crown, not just the edge of the blade. You think your aggression is your power, but it's your cage. She stepped even closer, her hand rising to rest, not on his chest, but on the side of his neck, her thumb brushing the pulse point that was currently hammering against his skin. The physical contact was like a short circuit. Joon-seok's breath hitched. He had spent a decade pretending he didn't remember the warmth of her touch, the way she could command his soul with a single look. The blood-red boss leaned into her hand, just for a second, his eyes closing as the icy exterior he had cultivated finally shattered. The romantic tension was a living thing between them, a mixture of unresolved grief, burning desire, and the shared burden of two boys who were the only bridge between their warring cultures. For a heartbeat, the Mafia boss and the Queen weren't enemies or allies. They were just two people who had once been everything to each other. You're still as stubborn as the day you left, Joon-seok murmured, his voice losing its lethal rasp and becoming something softer, something he hadn't used in 10 years. And you're still trying to fight the world alone, Chika replied, her gaze softening as she looked at him. But you aren't alone anymore, Joon-seok. You have a legacy now. Not a childless one, but a living, breathing future. Don't destroy it by trying to save it. She pulled her hand away, the cold air rushing back into the space she had occupied. The moment of vulnerability passed, but the air remained thick with the heat of their proximity. The boys watched from the edge of the mat, their sharp, attentive eyes taking in every look, every touch. They saw the boss and the Queen, and for the first time they saw a family. Fine, Joon-seok said, straightening his black shirt and reclaiming his mask, though it sat less securely than before. They will learn their heritage, but they will also learn how to survive. We do it together, or not at all. Chika gave a small, regal nod, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. Together. But the next time you pick up a dagger in front of my sons, you'll be answering to the queen, not the boss." She turned and walked away, her vibrant silks trailing behind her like a banner of war. Joon-seok stood on the mat, his heart still drumming a rhythm he couldn't control. He looked at the twins, then at the chess set in the corner. He realized that the clash of their cultures wasn't just a conflict, it was the only thing that could actually save them. He just had to be brave enough to let the queen lead the way. The Grand Seoul Cultural Gala was an exercise in glittering hypocrisy, a room filled with the city's elite who toasted to peace while standing on ground stabilized by Joon-seok's iron fist. The ballroom was a sea of black ties and silk gowns, the air heavy with the scent of expensive lilies and the underlying tension of a city that knew the blood-red boss was in attendance. Joon-seok stood near the edge of the terrace, his tuxedo a sharp midnight black that made the crimson silk of his pocket square look like a fresh wound. His amber eyes never stopped moving, scanning the crowd, the balconies, and the waitstaff with a predatory focus that made even his own lieutenants stay at a respectful distance. Beside him, Chika Eze was a beacon of emerald and gold. Her evening gown was a masterpiece of African craftsmanship, the fabric shimmering with every movement, while her head wrap sat like a crown of woven sunlight. She didn't look like a woman in hiding, she looked like a woman who owned the room. Kai and Kian stood between them, miniature versions of the man in black, their eyes mirroring their father's alertness. "You're vibrating, Joon-seok," Chika said softly, her voice barely audible over the string quartet. She didn't turn to look at him, keeping her regal profile toward the photographers. "The ice is back in your eyes. Relax before you scare the champagne out of the mayor's hand." "The leak wasn't just data, Chika," Joon-seok replied, his voice a low, lethal vibration. "It was an invitation. Every rival syndicate in this city knows that Childless Boss brought his legacy into the light tonight. This isn't a gala. It's a hunt." "Then let them see the queen they're trying to hunt," she countered, her hand briefly brushing the emerald fabric of her skirt. "My sons will not learn to fear the light because you are afraid of the shadows." The strike came at exactly 9:42 p.m., precisely when the main chandelier was dimmed for the keynote address. The first sign wasn't a shout, but the rhythmic thwip-thwip of suppressed fire. High above on the tech catwalks, two shadows shifted. Glass shattered, not from a bullet, but from a flashbang that erupted in a blinding white roar at the center of the dance floor. Chaos followed instantly. The elite of Seoul, usually so composed, became a screaming tide of silk and panic. Joon-seok's instinct was instantaneous. He stepped in front of Chika, his hand already drawing the weapon hidden beneath his jacket, his body a wall of black and red intended to take whatever was coming. "Get down!" he roared, but the sound was drowned out by the second explosion, a breech charge at the north entrance. Through the smoke and the strobe light effect of the emergency lights, Joon-seok saw them. 6 men in tactical gear, moving with the military precision of the Iron Dragon Syndicate. They weren't aiming for the mayor or the money. Every barrel was trained on the emerald gown and the 2 boys in gray. Joon-seok fired, dropping the lead infiltrator with a clinical efficiency, but he was pinned. A sniper from the balcony pinned him behind a marble pillar, the marble chipping away under a barrage of high-velocity rounds. "Chika, get the boys to the service lift," he yelled, preparing to draw the fire to himself, fully expecting to hear the sound of her retreating footsteps. Instead, he heard the sharp, rhythmic command of a queen. Chika didn't run. As the second wave of attackers moved in, she didn't collapse into a heap of terrified silk. She moved with a frightening, calculated calm. Using the momentum of the panic, she grabbed a heavy silver serving tray from a nearby table, using it as a makeshift shield against the flying glass as she pulled Kai and Kian into the alcove of a reinforced buffet station. She didn't just hide them, she positioned them. "Kai, the fire suppression lever is behind that curtain. Count to 3 and pull it. Kian, do not let go of your brother's belt." As a gunman rounded the corner, Chika didn't wait for Joon-seok to save her. She used the weight of the silver tray as a weapon, swinging it with a ferocious, grounded strength that caught the man across the throat, sending him sprawling. Before he could recover, the fire suppression system engaged. A thick, chemical fog that blinded the thermal goggles of the attackers. Joon-seok moved through the mist like a ghost. His red pockets square the last thing his enemies saw. He moved with a renewed, savage energy. His heart hammered not by fear, but by the sight of Chika standing over their sons in the middle of the fog, her emerald gown stained with dust, her face a mask of such terrifying regal bravery that it made his own legend seem pale. When the last of the Iron Dragon strike team lay silent on the marble floor and the sirens finally began to wail in the distance, Joon-seok stepped through the settling mist. His tuxedo was torn, and a line of blood ran down his cheek, but his gaze was fixed entirely on the woman in the alcove. Chika was breathing hard, her hand still clutching the silver tray. Her body still positioned as a physical shield over the twins. She looked up at him, her eyes burning with the fire of the Heir's lineage, defiant and unbroken. Joon-seok lowered his weapon. He didn't speak of the breach or the tactical failure. He looked at the woman he had once tried to discard, then at the sons she had raised in secret, and felt a surge of something he hadn't experienced in a lifetime. It wasn't just love, and it wasn't just protectiveness. It was respect. He reached out, his hand steady as he helped her to her feet, his fingers lingering on the emerald fabric of her sleeve. He didn't see a distraction or a weakness anymore. He saw a partner. He saw the only other person in the world who could stand in the middle of a war zone and not lose their crown. "The boys were right," Joon-seok whispered, his voice thick with a new, profound gravity. "I was trying to save everyone on the board. But I forgot that the Queen is the most dangerous piece of all." Chika straightened her head wrap, her dignity returning as if the violence had been nothing more than a passing storm. "I told you, Joon-seok. I am not a guest in your world. I am the reason your legacy survives it." Joon-seok nodded, a silent, grim vow passing between them as he pulled Kai and Kian close. The strike had failed, but the war had truly begun. And for the first time the blood-red boss wasn't fighting for himself. He was fighting for the Queen who had finally taught him the true meaning of power. The night following the gala was not silent. It hummed with the electric tension of a city waiting for a king to fall. Inside the primary study of the Kang Tower, the air was thick with the scent of expensive bourbon and the metallic tang of the weapons scattered across the obsidian desk. Kang Joon-seok stood by the glass, his reflection a ghost in red against the sprawling neon grid of Seoul. For 10 years, he had looked at this city and seen a kingdom he had conquered through the purity of his isolation. He had been the blood-red boss because he was a man with no gravity, nothing to hold him down, nothing to make him hesitate. The secure line on his desk chimed, a low, persistent vibration that signaled a call from the Council of Shadows, the elder statesman of the underworld who had sanctioned his rise. Joon-seok didn't turn around. He stayed staring at the city, his jaw tight. "Speak," he rasped. "Joon-seok." A voice came through, ancient and cold, devoid of any human warmth. "The Iron Dragon Syndicate has paralyzed our Incheon ports. The stock in Kang conglomerate is plummeting. Your childless legacy was the foundation of our trust in you. A boss with heirs is a boss with a leash. A boss with a foreign queen is a boss with a divided heart." Joon-seok's amber eyes narrowed, his reflection flickering as he tightened his grip on his glass. "My heart is exactly where I put it, Chairman. Under my ribs and behind a wall of lead. The Council offers you a path back to the light," the voice continued, ignoring his bravado. "Hand over the Heir's woman and the 2 boys to the Nigerian faction that seeks them. They want the bloodline extinguished. We want our stability restored. In return, the Council will erase the Iron Dragons by sunrise. You will remain the undisputed King of Seoul. Your empire will be secured for another 50 years. All you have to do is return to being the man you were. The man with nothing to lose." The silence that followed was heavy, pressing against Joon-seok's chest like a physical weight. The choice was laid bare. The childless legacy, the cold, perfect, invincible life he had spent a decade building, or the chaotic, vulnerable, and terrifyingly beautiful reality that had walked through his doors in gold and indigo silk. If he kept them, he would be at war with the world. If he gave them up, he would own it. He heard the soft click of the door behind him. He didn't need to turn to know it was Chika. He could feel her presence, the regal weight of her dignity, and the faint, haunting scent of jasmine. "The phone is loud, Joon-seok," she said, her voice a calm, low melody. She walked to the center of the room, her emerald gown from the gala replaced by a simple, elegant robe of deep black. Her head wrap removed to reveal the crown of her natural hair. She looked vulnerable, yet her eyes held the same immovable strength he had seen when she faced the assassins. "I know the price they are putting on our heads. I know what your empire is worth." Joon-seok finally turned, his gaze raking over her. "They want me to hand you over, to go back to the way it was, to be the end of the line again." "And would you?" she asked. There was no fear in her question, only a devastatingly honest curiosity. "You built this world on the idea that you were untouchable. Now, every breath my sons take is a crack in your armor." Joon-seok walked toward her, his boots heavy on the polished floor. He stopped inches from her, his height and the aggressive cut of his red shirt looming over her. He looked past her, into the hallway where Kai and Kian were asleep, their brilliant tactical minds finally at rest, dreaming of a father they had only just begun to know. He thought about the blind spot Kai had found and the chess piece Kian had sacrificed. They weren't just distractions. They were the only things he had ever truly owned that hadn't been bought with a bullet. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face before he finally settled it on her shoulder, his fingers digging into the fabric. "For 10 years, I thought I was invincible because I had nothing to lose," he whispered, his voice cracking with a raw, jagged emotion. "But I was just empty. I was a king of a graveyard, Chika." He turned back to the desk, his amber eyes burning with a new, lethal clarity. He picked up the secure phone. "Chairman," Joon-seok said, his voice regaining the roar of the tiger. "Tell the Iron Dragons to bring every man they have. Tell the council to start looking for my replacement. Because the Childless Legacy is dead. I am no longer the end of my line. I am the beginning of a dynasty." He slammed the phone down and swept it off the desk with a violent, final motion, the plastic shattering against the obsidian floor. He looked at Chika, the Black Queen who had brought fire back to his cold world. "The choice is made," he said, his face a mask of terrifying, protective resolve. "We lose the empire if we have to, but we keep the family. And if the world wants to take it from us, we'll make them bleed until the Han River runs as red as this suit." Chika reached up, her hand covering his on her shoulder, her eyes shimmering with a mixture of pride and a love that had survived a decade of silence. "Then let the war come, Joon-seok. The king and queen are ready." Outside, the first sirens of the council's retaliation began to wail in the distance, but inside the fortress, for the first time in 10 years, the blood-red boss was no longer alone. He had chosen the vulnerability of love over the safety of isolation, and in that moment, he had never been more dangerous. The night the Council of Shadows came for the Kang legacy was the night the sky over Seoul turned a bruised, electric purple, illuminated by the rhythmic flash of tracers and the cold, sweeping searchlights of the Iron Dragon helicopters. Inside the Kang Tower, the blood-red boss was no longer a man pacing a cage. He was a storm contained within a crimson suit. Kang Joon-seok stood in the tactical command center, his fingers flying across the screens, his amber eyes reflecting the digital maps of his crumbling empire. "The perimeter is breached," Joon-seok rasped, his voice a lethal vibration. He turned to Chika, who stood by the heavy obsidian table, her sons flanking her like young sentinels. "The service lift is secure. You have 3 minutes to get to the extraction point. My loyalists will take you to the coast. Go, Chika. Now." Chika didn't move. She didn't look at the extraction point, nor did she look at the escape route. She looked at the man she had loved for a decade, the man who was currently trying to sacrifice himself to become the end of the line one last time. She stepped into the blue light of the monitors, her black robe flowing around her like a shadow. A king does not tell his queen to run while the castle is under siege, Joon-seok, she said, her voice a low, immovable bell. And a mother does not teach her sons that the answer to a threat is to disappear into the fog. You told me you would be the monster. I am telling you to be the leader. We are the Eze family, and we do not retreat. We conquer. She reached into the folds of her robe and pulled out an encrypted drive, the digital keys to the Eze International conglomerate's hidden assets. You have the guns, Joon-seok. I have the leverage. The Council of Shadows thinks they own the banks of Seoul, but they have forgotten who provides the raw materials for their greed. If they take this tower, I will collapse the markets in 3 continents before they can toast to your demise. Joon-seok froze, his hand hovering over the execute button for his final defense protocol. He looked at Kai and Kian. The boys weren't trembling. Kai was already pointing at the secondary monitors. The traitors are in the ventilation shafts, father, Kai whispered, the word father hitting Joon-seok with more force than any bullet. If we flood the shafts with the fire suppression gas Kian used at the gala, they won't even reach the 40th floor. The realization hit Joon-seok with the force of a tidal wave. He wasn't the end. He was the centerpiece of a machine he had never fully understood. He reached out and grabbed Chika's hand, his fingers interlacing with hers, the heat of her skin anchoring him to the present. Together, he whispered. Together, she replied. The battle that followed was not a slaughter, but a surgical dismantling. With Kai's tactical observations and Kian's ruthless strategic sacrifices, Joon-seok moved through the fortress not as a lone wolf, but as the tip of a spear directed by the queen. They didn't just repel the Iron Dragons. They exposed the Council of Shadows' own corruption to the world, turning the very systems the elders used for control against them. By the time the sun began to peek over the jagged skyline of Seoul, the council was in ruins, and the blood-red boss was the only power left standing. 1 month later, the heavy oak doors of the Kong Tower's grand briefing room swung open. The world's media was gathered, their cameras flashing like 1,000 stars. For a decade, these rooms had only seen the end of the line. A man in red who spoke of nothing and left no trace. But today the image was different. Kang Joon-seok walked to the podium. He was wearing the deep red suit, the fabric impeccable, the color more vibrant than ever. But the aggression was gone. In its place was a terrifying, serene authority. He wasn't wearing the suit for war. He was wearing it as a royal robe. Beside him stood Queen Chika Eze, her gown a masterpiece of gold and velvet, her head wrap a crown of undeniable power. And between them stood Kai and Kian, their posture upright, their eyes sharp with the brilliance of their double heritage. The legend of the Childless Legacy was a lie, Joon-seok told the world, his voice steady and resonant, carrying the weight of a man who had finally found his heart. I spent 10 years believing that power was found in isolation. I was wrong. Power is found in the legacy we build and the family we protect. The Kong Syndicate is no longer a mafia. It is a dynasty. And as of today, we are not just ruling the shadows of Seoul. We are stepping into the light. He looked at Chika, and in the quiet space between the camera clicks, he saw the rainy autumn of 10 years ago. He saw the struggle, the secret, and the sacrifice. He reached out and took her hand in front of the world, a king standing beside his queen. The blood-red boss was dead. The king of the new dynasty had arrived. And as the twins stepped forward to stand at the edge of the podium, their amber eyes scanning the future, the world realized that the most dangerous man in Seoul had finally become the most powerful, because he was no longer a man with nothing to lose. He was a man with everything to live for.